Thanks for dropping in. This episode's actually with Dr. Hoi Cheu, but the topics we discussed here are more linguistics, literature, and music. Now, while I could have left it in the podcast, I actually decided to split it off. I felt like this would be a better bonus episode. You may have noticed that not all the history mentioned here is Canadian, although I am. Yes, I'm Rosie, a francophone from Canada. Now let's talk about some history, hey? So I know we had talked about this earlier one day when we were talking about linguistics, and you were explaining to me the differences in the languages between Hong Kong and China and the different regions. And if you don't mind talking a little bit about that, I thought that was very interesting, and some people might not be aware.
Well, long time ago, China was not one thing. And then all kinds of reasons the people get together, war, or simply dissolving culture and culture to a point. What we call the first emperor, it was about 1000 BC. If I remember correctly, check on the history part of me, the kingdom would actually beat the crap of 7 other countries to put China together.
So now, China was all different cultures and different indigenous
more or less one
peoples?
Culture, but it is a collective of many cultures and languages. And at that time was manifest in 8 different countries. But at a certain other point, it was one country called the Chou dynasty. And then eventually this emperor brought these countries together. But then he's scratching his head.
Because the communication was difficult between these countries?
Oh, yeah, because they speak different languages.
In one country.
And now one country, what do we do?
Yeah.
If it's India, it's actually really funny. Official language is English. Because British people rule them for a while, and English is easy to learn. But you don't have English 100 BC.
Yeah.
So
well, it was a mess back then, yeah.
No world dominant language. And so he came up with an idea. You don't unify language because that will require everybody to learn a new language. That's actually not possible. You can't suddenly say, okay, Canada is no longer French or English, let's speak Ojibwe. Can't do that, right? But he came up with the fact that let's unify the way we write. It's ideographic language, so it doesn't matter, right?
Because an image is an image, no matter what language you're using to explain
you see the moon, you can call it anything you want.
Yes.
but that symbol
is
the moon in any spoken language. So he unified the writing.
Did that bring up literacy just in general at that time?
Well, of course, and then you can actually the king can write something, and then everybody can understand.
So they had their own writing systems then, back then, probably.
A bit different, but not totally different. That's why that's possible. And then you also remember there were no universal education, so people who can read and write were relatively limited. So to make these people unify their writing it is a huge task, but not impossible, and he did it.
So in the European countries, you see a lot of people that are literate. Writing and reading were, the monks, let's say, in the medieval time. Who were the people that were literate? Was it more government officials?
Government...
more than the religious officials?
No, China does not have a single religion that will run everything. No, it's government, rich people enough to pay tutors to teach their children. Sometimes locally they can have schools. They will put children there, so there are scholars who are poor and things like that.
So there was a wide variety of people that were literate then. It wasn't just the
but it's not the percentage we have now.
Okay, yeah, no, obviously.
Let's put it that way. Yeah, so we unify the writing. Now most people know that they're Mandarin, Cantonese. These were the 2 major ones in the more recent time. Cantonese was a older language actually, more Chinese actually. So if you read Tong poems in the 7th and 8th century, if you read it in Cantonese, it will rhyme. If you read it in Mandarin, it won't. Sometimes. Ancient Chinese was closer to Cantonese.
Okay. So in different regions of China, you have different languages, as you had been mentioning. The linguistics were very interesting because people think that it's a different dialect of Chinese, but it's not. They're specific languages.
Sometimes it's different dialects, and sometimes it's actually entirely different languages.
And in Hong Kong, which type of... Was it a dialect?
In Hong Kong, it's primarily Cantonese.
Okay.
But so-called Cantonese should be called Huangchoulese because the Canton province itself has at least 60 different languages and over 300 dialects.
Wow, that's amazing.
The Canton province itself. The one that resisted the British opium.
Yeah.
And lead to the Opium War.
They kept their culture.
They kept their culture. It's actually a way to keep people's culture without destroying their language. Mm-hmm. That's why, unless the entire country speak Mandarin, there's no way Cantonese will win anymore. Unless you have that, you can't phoneticize Chinese, and still not ready for that. No.
So children now, they're learning Mandarin mostly in schools?
No, in Hong Kong, they're mostly Cantonese. That is the cultural aspect of the conflict.
Okay.
Because the well-developed China is now sending a lot of Mandarin-speaking people to Hong Kong, and Cantonese is dying, partly of its own doing. I went back to China. My parents live in the Canton province, not in Hong Kong. After they retire, they move up because it's cheaper there. And they are in an area that is actually the origin of the Cantonese language. And everywhere speak Mandarin. The taxi driver, everybody speak Mandarin. And then I asked my parents, how come everybody speak Mandarin now? They said, yes, because Canton got too rich. How does being rich have anything to do with it? Well, when people get rich, they do the better jobs, leaving nobody wanting to be taxi driver and waitress and so on. Then people from the rest of China come in and fill those positions.
So you hear more Mandarin on an everyday basis at that point.
Then you can't function without Mandarin, but you can function without Cantonese. And then everybody study Mandarin in school. Then now Cantonese became a kind of local language instead of a key language. And Hong Kong is not like that. People there felt threatened by it.
By Mandarin or by Cantonese?
By Mandarin.
By Mandarin, yeah.
And that is another reason that there's a strong desire. Not just a small fraction of the protesters were independent people who were seeking Hong Kong independence. And I think it's not fair that China identify the entire group like that. But a bigger group of it more so is to protect Hong Kong culture. They don't mind to be part of China, but they do not want to speak Mandarin and sing Mandarin songs or do things like that. There is more a reaction, a cultural reaction to China.
And Mandarin became a language from the common writing system. That's where Mandarin came from, or was it from a specific region in China, like the Cantonese?
When the king or twin unified Chinese, there were no Mandarin.
Okay.
Mandarin actually came from northern China much later. It's indeed actually not an original Chinese language, an invader language actually. But because once you use the same writing, it became Chinese, so it's Chinese. But
so it was a language that was constructed from different dialects or different languages?
It evolved much later. Let's put it that way.
Okay, interesting. I didn't know that.
It evolved much later and associated with some foreign invasion. But now all these cultures became part of China. But when it started, it wasn't. So there was Mandarin. But now communists successfully put China back together. And in voting, which would be the national language, Mandarin won by 1 vote.
Oh, wow. So it was a very big tie between Cantonese and Mandarin at that point.
Now, to be selfless and make an argument, I think it is the right thing. Cantonese is a hell to learn. It has a much richer tonality difference. Really, really difficult for anybody to learn whose mother tongue is not it. So I was surprised that Cantonese actually lose by only 1 vote is to lose bigger.
Yeah.
Mandarin is much easier language to learn.
So the rules are a little more simplified or more across the board?
The tonality.
The tonality is easier.
To speak it. I remember I attended an Anglican church when I was a high school kid. I sang in the choir. I wasn't a Christian, but I loved singing, so I joined it was one of the best choir in Hong Kong. And it's Anglican church, so British church. So one of the top governmental official, very nice a British woman came. She tried very hard, and she could speak really functional Cantonese. And she was reading, and then she said, let's turn to Xi Pin number, I forgot which number, because Xi Pin is the psalm. It translated into Chinese passages of poetry. Xi Pin is the actual pronunciation in Cantonese. Xi Pin, S-E-E-P-I-N. Mm-hmm. She got the tone wrong. Mm-hmm. She said Xi Pin, Xi Pin, Xi Pin. Mm-hmm. Xi Pin is diapers.
Oh no.
Shit pad. Xi, shit. pet peeve.
I'm sure. Did the congregation laugh at that point?
The congregation didn't laugh,
No.
but the children in the choir start giggling,
Yeah.
of course.
I'm sure they understood what she meant.
Yes,
Yeah.
but that is Cantonese.
Yeah, so Cantonese, the intonations are very close.
Intonation, I think they said 9. I actually couldn't count 9. English has 4, and so has Mandarin.
And Cantonese has 9.
Cantonese has 9.
Wow. And that subtlety might not be caught by somebody who's not.
Even though you know it, you won't keep track of it.
It's too much. Yeah.
And that is why, even though I love Cantonese, especially when you are swearing or arguing, it's a much more vivid language.
Yeah.
When you play with pun, because of the tonality, it's a much more fun language. But to be an official language, Mandarin's better.
Yeah, less complicated.
Less complicated. And part of the conflict actually come from deep down is both economical and cultural.
At the university, you do teach a lot of literature and English classes. So what's your favorite book or something you can recommend that really changed your world or that had an effect?
Well, my dissertation was on James Joyce. For people who really want to become a writer, they really should carefully study Ulysses, because every chapter, every episode in Ulysses is a very different experiment on style and really push the limit of how language can go.
Okay. Even in the translations?
Even in the translations. Yeah. I also think that something like the Dubliners, also James Joyce short story, is a really good way to teach students how to read. I actually spend time in my classes, actually read the short story with the students in class instead of saying, you go home and read it. Actually read it with them because of the sophistication of how to read, how to feel, and also it gives a really deep understanding into human psychology.
Psychology, okay.
Nature, too. Something actually is, we can all identify. It was the first British colony, Ireland, suffered greatly in James Joyce's time. And it is basically, what he wrote about is basically a group of people struggling in despair.
Which is such a human condition.
Which is a human condition that we cannot overlook. And he was able to find good things in these people. Even though a lot of critics complains that characters are so negative. But you had to read between the lines. And he left Ireland and never returned. All his major works were written abroad. But he never wrote about anything else but Ireland.
That's very interesting.
And it's a really moving, a really powerful moment about how literature works. And that's something I specialize in, actually. And of course, history takes an important part because it's Ireland.
It's always important. I absolutely agree with that. And I also know that you enjoy music quite a bit and you're involved in a lot of music. And do you have also, maybe not necessarily a favorite, but some style of music that you prefer or something you want to mention about music?
Dmitri Shostakovich.
Yeah, that's the first thought?
Oh, I have no doubt about it. I have been crazy about this guy since 1975 when I was 9 years old.
Yeah? And what was it about it that really spoke to you?
Well, he's a socialist, but also suffered Stalin. Writing to survive in great despair. And I don't see... I see a lot of common connection between Joyce and Shostakovich, even though they live in very different history and condition. But deep down, he's a real socialist. Not that he supports totalitarian state, as often misunderstood, but somebody who write music for the betterment of the society. One of the most powerful moments was Symphony number 7, I believe. I forgot which. Symphony number 7 was written when Hitler was surrounding Leningrad and Moscow. A lot of people starved to death.
Yes.
And he wrote the symphony, and people in their hunger, and the orchestra, I think 1/3 of the orchestra also died, and they played it, and it was a full house. There was the only hope that keep people together. It's the kind of art that I care about, because it care about people.
He wrote it for a reason. He didn't just...
He wrote it for a reason. He wrote it to make the world better, to find voice for the people.
To bring light into the world.
To bring light into the world. You're right. In an almost impossible situation. And that is the kind of art that actually live on.
So you enjoy those difficult stories that really still make you think, or the difficult music that still make you think about the situation at the time. So you're not just appreciating the art, but you're also appreciating all that history at the same time.
You really want me to say that I love history? I won't say that, but that's the condition how I can understand the art. But history never touched me the way the art touched me, because it's not done to do that. But to understand certain art, sometimes, not actually, most of the time, you need the context to appreciate it. So you say, why young people don't listen to classical music? Not because the classical music don't rock, but because they don't have the context to understand it.
When it was written.
Or just the context to understand artistically what the artist is trying to do.
I fell in love with Beethoven because of all the things that happened to him.
Yep. Once you understand that, it is so much more moving. And no, it's not that the work of art itself doesn't stand alone. If you listen to Beethoven without knowing his life, you can still be moved. Ode to Joyce still is joyful in the last movement. The funeral march in the Eroica Symphony is still a funeral march. But you know what Beethoven was struggling, his revolutionary impulse. There's another artist that really want the world better with his art. Then you appreciate so much more.
Especially when he became deaf and he's still writing music.
It's
just incredible.
Yeah, exactly. So to me, history is like, I'm like a doctor, right? Trying to take history of the patients. Do you to deal with a patient's cancer or diabetes without history? You can, but you can do so much more if you have the history right.
Yes, absolutely. There's not always going to be a book recommendation for the bonus episodes, but this one fit right in. So the book recommendation today is more of an author recommendation. As you've heard Dr. Cheu mention, anything by James Joyce, such as Ulysses or Dubliners he referred to, would be great to continue your learning. You can find me on social media, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, @History. And apparently, you can rate me on iTunes. I also want to thank my husband, Jamie, our bunch of kids, our family, our friends, and all the people who had this crazy belief in me. As I've said before, un grand merci.